Hello, and welcome again to another of Huddersfield Local History Society's online talks. Today's talk is a particularly special one. 9 years ago, to mark the bicentenary of the Luddite disturbances here in the West Riding, we published Alan Brooke and the late Leslie Kipling's remarkable, groundbreaking, maybe definitive book, Liberty or Death, Radicals, Republicans and Luddites. 2 years later, in 2014, in partnership with the University of Huddersfield, we agreed to make our commemoration of the Luddite period and all that it has come to mean an annual event as our Luddite Memorial Lecture. Each year since then, a succession of distinguished historians have shared their own thoughts with us on the significance of the Luddite period and on the bigger picture of 19th century radicalism in the West Riding and much further afield. This year's lecture is dedicated to the memory of our 2015 Luddite Memorial lecturer, Professor Malcolm Chase. He died far too young, a little over a year ago. Malcolm was a good friend to the Society and a generous colleague. He spoke at one of our Saturday's study days, and as the guiding spirit, major contributor and occasional proofreader for our 2018 publication on the Chartist movement, The Charter, Our Right. To individual members, he was a friend and a supportive champion of their work. He is sorely missed. This year's lecturer, Professor Edward Royal, is one of Malcolm's many good friends and colleagues, and he will say much more in his own tribute in a little while. And with that, I'd like to invite Professor Tim Thornton on behalf of the University of Huddersfield to introduce this year's Luddite Memorial Lecturer.
My name is Tim Thornton, and I'm a Professor of History and a Deputy Vice-Chancellor at the University of Huddersfield. And it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the University to this, the latest in the series of Luddite lectures. Since their inception, the lectures have been jointly supported and promoted by the University and the Huddersfield and District Local History Society. This represents an important partnership for the University, allowing us to address an important aspect of local heritage alongside the leading local historical organisation in our area. This year marks the first of these annual lectures since the death of Professor Malcolm Chase. Malcolm was a great supporter of these lectures and himself gave one of the lectures on the subject of York Castle and its role as a political prison for many of those involved in Luddite and kindred movements. Many of us will be thinking of Malcolm this year, and it's fitting in that context that we add yet another eminent lecturer to the roll who delivered these lectures. Professor Ted Royal, again a long-standing supporter of these lectures, and like Malcolm, unsurpassed in the committed and rigorous scholarship which underpins all of his contributions to the subject. I know, like me, you'll be very much looking forward to Ted's talk on radicalism in the West Riding, 1790 to 1890.
This lecture is dedicated to the memory of Malcolm Chase. Malcolm was a leading exponent of British radical history until his premature death from a brain tumour in February 2020, just as the first lockdown was descending on us all and disrupting his memorial service. This is my opportunity to say a few words now about him. I first met Malcolm when he came to study history at York in 1975, having already published one article in a local history journal in his native Essex. In 1978, he took my third-year special subject on Owenism, where he joined an exceptionally able group of students eager to learn about and discuss early 19th century British radicalism and Owenite socialism. After he had graduated with a first in 1978, I felt it would be best for him to move to Sussex, where Professor John Harrison was available to supervise his research. He chose as his doctoral topic Thomas Spence and the Land Question in British Radicalism, ultimately leading to his first book, The People's Farm, English Agrarian Radicalism 1775 to 1840, which was published in 1988. And in this book, he saw agrarianism not as a backward-looking movement, but as a progressive alternative to mainstream radical ideas. He retained an interest in green issues and the environment throughout his life. After a temporary job in the University of Exeter, he joined the University of Leeds in 1982, where he began his career in that cradle of much modern social and labour history, the Department of Adult Education. Put in charge of the outpost in Middlesbrough, he rapidly made it the most successful of all the department's centres, and he threw himself into adult education classes and lectures as he mastered the local history of the area. When that centre was closed, he returned to base in Leeds and later became the departmental head. It was always much to my regret that he was unsuccessful in his application in obtaining a post at the University of York when I retired in 2004. But perhaps alerted by this application, the following year he joined the School of History at Leeds and later became its head of department. Meanwhile, he continued as an inspiring teacher, committed to his students of all ages and backgrounds, willing and successful as a lecturer with many different audiences, and also a prolific author. The People's Farm was followed in 2000 by a study of early trade unionism, fraternity skill, and the politics of labour. Now, there's not time here to dwell on his many articles and essays, but I should mention his transition into the leading historian of the Chartists with his book Chartism, A New History, published in 2007. It's typical of Malcolm's modesty that he subtitled it A New History, not The New History, though in fact over the past decade or so it has become the standard work interpreting for us in a new and enlightening way the Chartist movement. He also became the member of a group which organized an annual Chartist Day at which historians, amateur and professional, gathered at some interesting locality, on 2 occasions a Chartist land colony site, to hear and discuss and celebrate Chartism. He also published an online Chartist news sheet to keep us all up to date. In his academic work, he was drawn backwards chronologically to the generation before the Chartists for a study of the year 1820, Disorder and Stability in the United Kingdom, published in 2015. In this work, he drew together the various things of that momentous year in the wake of the Peterloo Massacre of 1819. Also in 2015, Malcolm was the Luddite lecturer here with his lecture on York Castle and its political prisoners, the Luddites in a broader context. It so happens that the first Luddite lecture the previous year, 2014, had been given by Matthew Roberts, who was another undergraduate at York, whom I had the pleasure of teaching. And now it's my turn to be the Luddite lecturer. Radicalism in the West Riding, 1790 to 1890. Luddite lectures in previous years have focused on individual radical episodes around the time of Luddite activity in the early 19th century. But in this lecture, I shall take a longer view of radicalism throughout that century. I shall look at the political, social, and economic ground in which West Riding, and in particular West Yorkshire radicalism, was rooted. And I shall take a broader view of what constituted radicalism in the 19th century. I shall then suggest how these various events and radicalisms entered into memory and tradition to constitute a story or myth which express the collective identity of the people and communities of West Yorkshire. I shall not have time to examine all the better-known examples of radicalism throughout the century, you'll be glad to learn. But I do hope to introduce some of its lesser-known aspects and some of the personalities who contributed to our regional history. The West Riding was a large county, the third largest in England, its 1.5 million acres being surpassed only by Devon and Lincolnshire. It reached from Sedbergh in the north down to Sheffield in the south, and from the outskirts of Oldham beyond the Pennines in the west to Goole in the east. In all, 95 miles from north to south and 48 miles from west to east. Though it was a predominantly upland county with 2/3 of its agricultural land under pasture, that still left it with almost as much arable land as an arable county such as Kent. So when we speak of the West Riding, we must be careful not to generalize. There were some parts of the West Riding where radicalism was strong, but there were many other parts that were predominantly conservative. Nevertheless, overall, the West Riding can be said to have played a significant part in the growth of many forms of radicalism during the period from the late 18th century, when the French Revolution made its impact on British politics, through to the eve of the First World War, when the Labour Party was making a serious attempt to supplant the Liberal Party as the main parliamentary conduit for radical activity. When I first started studying radical movements, now over 40 years ago, I began with 19th century popular freethought, collecting information about local societies from the days of the Owenite Rational Society in the late 1830s through the 1840s and 1850s to the secularist movement. The mapping of these societies revealed an interesting geographical pattern. By far the largest concentration outside London lay in Lancashire and the northwest. 28 societies, including 23 Owenite branches. And only 3 of these locations, Lancaster, Liverpool and Wigan, lay outside what used to be known by the acronym SELNEC, South East Lancashire, North East Cheshire. And the second region was Yorkshire, with 12 societies, including 7 Owenite branches, all but one of which, Hull, were in the West Riding. And all but 2 of these, Sheffield and Doncaster, were in the present West Yorkshire. The first Owenite branch to be formed in the whole of Yorkshire was Huddersfield. When I extended this study to cover secularism in its prime after 1866 through to the closing decades of the 19th century, the map not unsurprisingly looked very similar, although the areas had now become more extensive and there had been a considerable expansion in the northeast. Lancashire in the northwest now had 32 locations, 22 of them in Selneck. Yorkshire had 25, 18 of them in West Yorkshire. Durham and South Northumberland now had 22, and there are also concentrations of societies in the East Midlands and the West Midlands. Shortly after working my way through this data, David Jones published his Chartism and the Chartists, in which he included a map of National Charter Association localities in December 1841. And the distribution was the same, only with more dots to represent the fact that the NCA was a much larger organization. Selneck, again, had the most powerful showing, matching that of London, with West Yorkshire showing up a close second. Furthermore, if we were to take either of these maps and superimpose them on maps showing such economic data as population density, urbanization, and manufacturing output, we should again find a close fit. So when we are examining radicalism, which I'm defining as organized expressions of extra-parliamentary opinion demanding extensive political, economic, and/or social change, we are in fact looking at a phenomenon closely linked to urbanization and industrialization. Well, this is hardly a novel conclusion, but it's worth remembering. The West Riding was radical not because it is a part of Yorkshire and Yorkshiremen are notoriously cussed and proudly independent, But it was because parts of the riding had an unusually intense experience of those socio-economic changes, which for convenience we call the Industrial Revolution. The largest centre of manufacturing, it is true, was in London, the largest urban centre, and at the heart of the political nation. Any radical movement which hoped to influence national political decisions had to be strong in London. But London's manufacturing was in most cases pre-industrial in its organisation and fragmented into small units of employment and across many trades, the exceptions being, by the standards of the day, brewing and shipbuilding. Though the metropolis was significant in the history of radicalism, it did not make the impact one might have expected from its size and economic importance. It did not, for example, play the same part as Paris, the much smaller capital city of France, in national radical politics. The heart of the new society that represented the social face of the Industrial Revolution was to be found 100 and more miles to the north, where the provinces experienced not simply a concentration of production and population, but of specific forms of both material and organization. Though some areas of manufacturing concentration were identified with other products such as pottery in the North Staffordshire or metal goods in the West Midlands or steel in South Yorkshire, the areas which produce most radical organizations, Selkirk and West Yorkshire, together with parts of the East Midlands, were above all identified with the production of textiles, cotton, wool, silk, and flax. These were the raw materials of the first Industrial Revolution, which might be dated from about 1780 to 1850. Thereafter, the basis of production expanded to include more heavy manufacturing, using iron and steel as these products were applied to railway and steamship construction. My broadening map of secularism with the rising importance of Wearside and Tyneside can be related directly to the growth of this second post-1850 Industrial Revolution. But in the early stages of industrialization, radical organization was strongest in areas of textile production. I don't often quote Engels these days, but may I remind you of the rather deterministic opening he has in The Condition of the Working Class in England, first published in 1845, and drawing on both personal observation and a great deal of other contemporary literature and comment. He wrote, "The history of the proletariat in England begins with the second half of the last century, with the invention of the steam engine and of machinery for working cotton. These inventions gave rise, as is well known, to an industrial revolution, a revolution which altered the whole civil society." This language may well belong to the later 19th century when the work was translated into English, but the sentiments capture what was going on in the 1840s. And with this in mind, we can now focus on the West Riding as one of the major seats of this socio-economic transformation and its generation of radical activities on an unusual scale. As we've already noted, the West Riding was an extensive and varied county. The major manufacturing area in the south, sited in the Upper Don Valley and its tributaries around the town of Sheffield, was well established by the late 18th century in the production of steel, with skilled craftsmen, small workshops, and harsh working conditions for many. Grinding poverty was their lot, and that pun is intended. For the grinders, so important in the manufacture of steel implements, were old and worn out, if not dead, at the age of 40. As the Sheffield poet Ebenezer Elliott cried out, "Flowers of thy heart, O Lord, are they. Let them not pass like weeds away. Their heritage a sunless day. God save the people." This refrain caught the public mood. It became the people's anthem. So Sheffield became an early centre of radicalism from the 1790s onwards, as the people set out to save themselves. And a generation later, Sheffield was to begin the tumultuous 1840s with an armed rising on the streets, and end them with the town council sending a message of support to the revolutions of Paris in 1848. But the bulk of radical activity throughout this period, increasingly so as the 19th century developed, was to be found further north, in the areas dominated by textile production, in the Aire and Calder valleys and their tributaries. Critics of Edward Thompson's thesis in The Making of the English Working Class, who point out how much of his evidence is actually drawn from this part of the world, make my point. It was here that the working class was made, or better, where the working class made itself. These parts of the West Riding experienced the new society in its most extreme form. Of the 7 major towns with populations over 100,000 in England in 1851, 3 of them, Leeds, Sheffield and Bradford, were in West and South Yorkshire. The others were Manchester and Liverpool, Birmingham and Bristol. But it's not the existence of these large towns that is important, but the fact that they were surrounded by what the 1831 census described as high aggregate population of connected places. Thus, while the population of Halifax Township was only just over 15,000 in 1831, the connected places of Halifax Parish had a total population of nearly 110,000, and Bradford, with a population of only just over 23,000 in 1831, had a population in connected places over 3 times as great. So, while it's important to appreciate the relatively urbanized condition of this part of the West Riding, particularly in the early 19th century, when much of Britain was still rural, it's equally important to appreciate the nature of the semi-urban society, which affected and influenced far more people than could strictly be defined as town dwellers. This was a society of industrial farmsteads and hamlets, villages and small towns. Some were to grow into recognizable towns in the modern sense as the century developed, but others never did. Arlenburg, for example, was a township that never became a town. Its population in 1831 was just over 7,000, but its connected places in its extensive parish brought that total up to over 30,000, about the same as lived in the neighbouring parish of Huddersfield. The proportions were similar in Birstall parish, with a population of over 24,000, but with the largest settlement, Gummersall, having only a quarter of that. Overall, there were 9 towns in the West Riding with a population of over 10,000 in 1831, but there were 12 more places with contiguous populations of over 10,000. And in Leeds parish, there were 2 out townships, Holbeck and Hunslet, which themselves had populations of over 10,000. This distribution of population gives us the social context within which radicalism could breed. Here was a part of the country where the population was sufficiently concentrated to attain critical mass, but at the same time one in which individual communities were small enough to develop and sustain their individual interests and identities, sometimes in competition with each other. This combination of separate communities within an area of contiguous population found expression throughout the 19th century in camp meetings, held in favoured rural locations in the middle of nowhere, and so in the middle of everywhere. Places like Peep Green on Hartshead Moor, Castle Hill outside Huddersfield, Shipley Glen in the Aire Valley upstream of Bradford, and Blackstone Edge, where Lancashire could meet Yorkshire in a common cause. The widespread nature of this semi-rural, semi-urban population is also politically important. Many of these people continue to live outside the boundaries of those parliamentary boroughs created for the first time in 1832 and extended in 1867. Not only was the £10 household vote of 1832 not for them, but neither was the household vote of 1867. In the county, the 40-shilling freeholder qualification had some meaning in a land of clothiers and weaver farmers. But as was demonstrated in 1807, when an electorate of over 23,000 perhaps a tenth of the total national vote, made their way to York to cast their ballots in an election resembling more elections of recent times rather than the narrow borough elections imprinted on our minds by Charles Dickens in Pickwick Papers. Elections in Yorkshire, Lord Milton, the Whig candidate, declared to freeholders gathered in the Peace Hall at Halifax during the 1807 canvass. Elections teach the rich not to despise the poor, and they show the poor that they are not altogether dependent on their more opulent neighbours. They express the collective wisdom of the country. This was not just electoral flattery. The 1807 election was the first full county election in Yorkshire since 1734, and it was to be an important step in the politicisation of both electors, being able to elect someone for the first time, and non-electors alike, and it influenced them for a generation and more, a point to which I shall return later. But independent clothiers and weaver farmers were a dying breed. Politics in the West Riding were to be dominated for the most part by aristocratic landed proprietors like the Earl of Dartmouth, the Earl of Cardigan, the Duke of Leeds, as well as those protagonists of the 1807 election, the Lascelles family of Harwood and the Fitzwilliams of Wentworth Woodhouse. And in the boroughs, it was to be the newly enfranchised middle classes who dominated politics, not the independent weaver farmers of 1807. Only in 1884 was the vote extended to male heads of household in regular occupation of property in large parts of the industrial West Riding, and only in 1885, with the abolition of the distinction between boroughs and counties, were those many heads of household granted what their truly urban fellows had been given by the Reform Act of 1867. Well, that forms the socio-political context within which radicalism developed. What of the socio-economic context? The first point to make is that this too was extremely complex, and the shorthand textile districts does the region as a whole less than justice. The Industrial Revolution in textile production relied, as Engels had noted, on the steam engine, and that meant even in the early 19th century, some iron founding, engineering, and coal mining. Though Leeds was the major centre for engineering, Bradford had important ironworks at Byerley, Bowling, and Lowmore, and every town had its machine makers. Coal mining was also diffused throughout the area, with shallow pits on the exposed coal field as far north as Leeds. Conversely, Barnsley, which we may think of as an important coal mining centre in the 20th century, was noted in the early 19th century as a linen weaving town, which attracted a considerable Irish population who left their marks on both Chartism and later Republican activity. The same diversity is to be found in patterns of employment. The adult male labour force was certainly not a factory proletariat. Most of the workforce in the woolen, but especially in the worsted mills, were women and young people. And yet the factory, typically employing 100 or fewer workers, dominated economic life. A man may well have experienced the factory when he was a child, or through the employment of his wife and sister and children. And he might also work in the mill in a supervisory capacity as an overlooker or tuner, or as a labourer pushing skips, or shoveling coal in the boiler house, or as a skilled worker in the mechanic's shop. Or he might have experienced the factory negatively, as a form of organised labour and production that had rendered redundant his own way of life, as a domestic handloom weaver or a workshop woolcomber. Or he might have found employment in the expanding economy of the second industrial revolution of the later 19th century, perhaps drawn in search of work to the growing larger centres of population such as Leeds, with its increasingly diverse and complex economy, offering a wide range of both skilled and unskilled employment. But in the smaller and more typical communities of the early and mid-century, it was the factory which was dominant, even the single mill. In 1845, 8 of the 9 cotton warp manufacturers listed in the trade directory for Ripponden were based in Ripponden Mill, and so presumably were their workers. Though not an individual adult male experience, work at the mill was a family and community experience. For the factory lay at the heart of the community. It was the mill that determined the social and economic history of the community. A couple of examples. The perpetual curate of the church at Denham Gate reported to the bishop in 1858, "In November last, my day school was seriously affected by the burning down of a large mill, reducing the number of scholars from 230 to the present number 160. And the Leeds Mercury helpful tells us of the destruction of Denham Mill, which had put 900 people out of work." And another example from the same source at Oakworth. One of the 2 principal manufacturing firms in this neighbourhood, and the one on which the church and national school were chiefly dependent, failed about 4 years ago, and the mills have not been in much work since. Many families were compelled to leave the neighbourhood. The attendance at our day school fell at once from 220 to less than 100. At present, we have about 30. There are 3 mills unoccupied. Politics are shaped by many circumstances, but employment would appear to be among the more important. Relationship to the means of production may not determine culture in a direct sense, but the experience of that relationship on the ground can influence the culture of an individual and of a community. In that sense, West Yorkshire was composed of mill towns and mill communities. Nevertheless, this still left room for individual development. I've always been intrigued by the possibility that Philip Snowden, born in 1864, and John William Gott, born in 1866, who both came from Cowling or Cooling on the borders of the West Riding between Keighley and Colne, that they probably knew each other as children. The one, Snowden, a devout Wesleyan. He became a socialist and ended up in the cabinet. The other, Gott, a convinced atheist, also a socialist, ended up in jail as the last man in England to be imprisoned for blasphemy. But both men were radicals, both men were socialists, both men were products of the same community in the West Riding. So we must bear in mind the diversity of the riding and of the social and economic context it offered. But we should also note the diversity of radicalisms within it. At the start of this lecture, I defined radicalism as organized expressions of extra-parliamentary opinion demanding extensive political, economic, and/or social change. But that is only part of the story. Radicalism could be parliamentary. The West Riding had a strong Whig presence through the influence of aristocratic families, such as the Fitzwilliams, who were not only extensive landowners in the southern part of the riding, but were also related to families which exerted strong influences in parts of West Yorkshire, families such as the Ramsdens of Huddersfield. Yet alongside the Whigs were Liberals and Radicals. The latter, though, were seldom strong enough on their own to claim many parliamentary seats before 1885. For example, at the 1847 general election, when Richard Cobden was returned as a member for the West Riding in an election which did not go to the poll, Leeds was actually more typical, with the radical Quaker Joseph Sturge coming a respectable but unelected third, behind the Conservative banker William Beckett, who topped the poll, and the Whig flax manufacturer James Garth Marshall. And in the Halifax election of the same year, the radical vote actually exceeded that of the other parties, but it was divided between the nonconformist Edward Mile and the Chartist Ernest Jones, neither of whom was elected, with the result that a Conservative, Henry Edwards, topped the poll, followed by Sir Charles Wood, the aristocratic county Whig, who represented the borough unbroken from 1832 to 1865. And in the 1857 election, Cobden was defeated by a Liberal Whig candidate in Huddersfield. So there are strong grounds for preferring the extra-parliamentary definition of radicalism in the terms in which I'm discussing it in this lecture. In strictly parliamentary terms, it was liberalism rather than radicalism that defined the county's politics, and with a strong conservative presence. Only after 1885, with the demise of the Whigs and the appearance of politically organised and enfranchised Labour, did that position begin to change. The victory of the socialist Victor Grayson over both Liberal and Conservative opponents at the 1907 Colne Valley by-election was symbolic, but only symbolic. It was a potent symbol of things yet to come. Colne Valley was one of those semi-urban areas dignified as an urban district in 1894, which included industrial villages and small mill towns straddled across the Pennines, and newly enfranchised only in 1885. Even so, the Conservative historian George Kitson Clarke may have been right when he once playfully asserted that his uncle, Sir James Kitson, whose elevation to Lord Airedale had created the by-election opportunity in 1907, had Lord Airedale been fighting Grayson, the latter would surely have been beaten by Uncle James. That, after all, had been the fate of Tom Mann in the Colne Valley in 1895. One could argue, though, that the word radicalism should not be confined to politics, for men and women did not live by politics alone, especially in the 19th century. Despite the fact that Lord Airedale was a leading Leeds Unitarian, and so in that respect might be described as a radical liberal, the rest of his family were Church of England men and women, and increasingly inclined to the conservative position. Religion, as Kitson Clarke again was wont to observe, provides a more meaningful marker than politics alone of how people express their identities and beliefs. As a crude generalization, one could venture to assert that the Church of England had a strong appeal to conservatives, while Baptist Congregationalists and the several Methodist splinter groups, along with Unitarians and Quakers, were invariably liberals. And the Wesleyan Methodists were a mixed bunch, mainly conservative before 1830, inclined to liberal unionism, liberal imperialism, or conservatism after 1885, but solidly liberal with their fellow nonconformists in the mid-century years. To be a nonconformist was to challenge one pillar of the establishment, and so to put oneself outside or only on the fringes of the mainstream of national life. It made one, at the very least, a liberal, perhaps one with radical inclinations. This was profoundly important for the West Riding, for the county was a stronghold of nonconformity. In the large parishes of Bradford, Leeds, Halifax, Huddersfield, and Almonbury, in such places, nonconformity was rampant, and with it radicalism and liberalism. As Bishop Longley was to note of this part of the world in 1841, the church was under attack from dissent and Chartism, though 2 years later he was able to add with more satisfaction that both were now in decline. That may in the longer term have been true of Chartism, but the West Riding remained the home of religious dissent. We're back in Cowling with Philip Snowden, the Wesleyan. But the dissent of the West Riding was of a peculiar kind that expressed individuality. The predominant form of opposition to the church came from Wesleyan Methodism, but it was a Wesleyanism itself prone to unusually severe fissures, as local chapels rejected central authority and local congregations rejected chapel authority. In the great Wesleyan reform crisis of 1849 to 50, the West Riding was one of the most significant centres, as local chapels challenged the undemocratic and clerical rule of the Wesleyan Conference. The first conference of reformers, as they made their way towards forming a separate Methodist connection, was held in Sheffield in 1852. And this was but the last in a series of outbursts of Wesleyanism. In 1827, a row over the decision to install an organ in Brunswick Chapel, Leeds, had led to the loss of 1,000 members in Leeds alone, in rebellion against the authoritarian structures of Wesleyanism, which sought to tell ordinary members of the congregation how to run their own affairs, and to subject their worship to the controlling decision of their wealthy trustees, backed by the Wesleyan Conference. And before this, the earliest Wesleyan eruption, which produced the Methodist New Connection in 1797, had occurred in Leeds and found some of its strongest and most lasting support in Sheffield, as well as throughout West Yorkshire. The New Connection itself was in turn the subject of a major schism in the 1840s, when Joseph Barker left the Connection, taking with him over a quarter of the entire national membership. Again, West Yorkshire was a Barkerite stronghold, and Barker, who came originally from Bramley, based his activities in the later 1840s in Wortley, near Leeds. Radical Methodism was never far below the surface of chapel liberalism in West Yorkshire. The strength of these radical reactions within Wesleyanism is illustrated by events in Huddersfield. Following the withdrawal of the New Connection after 1797, the Wesleyan circuit numbers for Huddersfield fell from 1,700 to only 520, and that left the Central Town Society with only 6 members and no chapel. And after the Wesleyan Reform crisis of 1850, circuit membership fell from 1,500 to 486, and the main chapel in Queen Street was controlled by the Reformers until 1857. Even within official Wesleyanism, with its strong Tory leadership in the early years, there are signs that the ordinary congregations were more radical in their views. The Leeds Mercury gleefully reported the failure of the first anniversary services of the Queen Street Chapel in 1820, when the much-needed collections fell far short of expectation on account of the ministers neglecting to pray for the Queen. Great numbers went with a view to contributing but took their money home again, owing to this disloyal omission. Now, though this might constitute one of the less familiar protests at the Tory government's treatment of Queen Caroline, it's a clear evidence of a widespread dissatisfaction at that time with the Tory politics of the clerical leadership, even though Queen Caroline was not the most obviously deserving object of Wesleyan sympathy. The point of these examples from the history of Wesleyanism is not to claim that the Wesleyans were by nature and inclination friends and supporters of the more popular forms of radicalism, for decidedly they were not. In 1807, many of them exercised the vote for the first time in their lifetime in favour of Lascelles' candidature and the Tories, because the latter was sound on the Protestant issue. The point in mentioning them is to illustrate the presence of diverse and conflicting radicalisms, which can be seen as similar and parallel to manifestations of the general independence of spirit and willingness to challenge constituted authority in various forms, which we find in West Yorkshire. The description of Luddite Huddersfield in 1813 as a metropolis of discontent could be applied equally in both political and religious spheres. So, having suggested some of the social and economic context for the presence of radicalisms in the West Riding, and having entered all the caveats about the size and diversity of the riding, the strength of forces other than radicalism, and the presence of many and different forms of radicalism, I now wish to turn to the radicalism of myth and seek the reality within it. Myth should not be contrasted with reality as though they were mutually exclusive. The difference between the two lies not in truth and falsehood, but in the uses to which the historical record is put, though those usages may in time lead to some distortion of the record. Myth is a way of presenting a story to convey a greater truth than that conveyed by the facts alone. What helped make the myths of radicalism in the West Riding is not the mere narration of events, but the construction of those events into a story with a message, woven across the generations into a tradition. The message told of a popular struggle by working people to gain recognition not only of their political rights, important though that was, but beyond that, recognition of themselves, not as economically oppressed and discounted creatures, but as independent and respectable people, worthy members of respectable communities. The authors of this myth lived largely in the later 19th century, around the time of the extension of the franchise after 1867, followed by elections for school boards after 1870, and then elections to the House of Commons after 1884 and 5, right through to the urban and rural district council elections after 1894. Some of these authors looked back on the past with pride and excused or even romanticized its violence as necessitated by the conditions of a different age. But others sought to distance themselves from the past by making it merely the starting point for a progressively rational and improving way of life, the story of progress, even, in the words of Joseph Lawson's autobiography, progress in Pudsey. The medium for this was the local press and the stories told to local journalists. The motivation was partly local and personal pride, partly educative, as with Lawson's Letters to the Young, partly a perception that there was a story to be told before the actors sank into the permanent silence of their graves, and partly, let's admit it, money, for several of those authors had a marketable story to tell, and they'd no savings or pension to fall back on in old age, only memories. Of the author-journalists who collected these memories, perhaps the most influential was Frank Peel. Born in Bradford, he lived and worked in the Spen Valley, Heckmondwike, Cleckheaton and Dewsbury, at the heart of what was once celebrated as the heavy woolen district. But his story started in the wider West Riding with the Constitutional Society begun in Sheffield in December 1791, distributing Thomas Paine's works widely across the southern West Riding, much as they were disseminated throughout all the industrial districts of England. And one man whose radicalism could almost certainly be traced back to this time was John Baines, a Halifax hatter, who entered the historical record when he was tried and transported for his involvement in Luddism in 1812-13, but whose presence with other Tom Painers was recalled by Peel sources as meeting earlier at the Crispin hostelry, lovingly recreated here at Shibden Hall Museum. The Crispin, which was not far from the parish church in Halifax. Luddism constituted Peel's real starting point, as it does for my own personal story. Peel recalled that the great hammer used by the Luddites in breaking the frames was always known as Enoch, after the leading partner in the firm chiefly engaged in their manufacture. Now, I recall in my youth going to the Tilson Museum in Huddersfield on many occasions to see one such Enoch, and then having a trip to Marsden, where Enoch and James Taylor had their foundry and workshop, and seeing the grave of Enoch Taylor in Marsden Old Churchyard. And I can recall passing by the site of John Wood's cropping shop at Longroy Bridge, and learning why a street of 20th century housing in Dryclough on Crossland Moor was called William Horsfall Street. Historical imagination was fed alike by the Tolson Memorial Museum's publication of 1935, Huddersfield, History of the Huddersfield Woolen Industry, and also by novels such as Phyllis Bentley's Inheritance or The Crowthers of Bankdown by Thomas Armstrong. I can recall going to the Winston at Slathwaite to see the film made of The Crowthers of Bankdown starring Tom Walls. And maybe if you were watching Channel 4 in January 2021, you could have seen the film again. And later, I recall reading Charlotte Bronte's Shirley and Benno Bill's The Luddite, written by the radical solicitor D.F.E. Sykes in 1899. So myth was born, but in the reality of history and tradition and community. Peel took his story on from Luddism to the Chartist and plug draws of the 1840s, which enabled him to appeal to folks still alive and with stories to tell from their own experiences. But before that, he closed his Luddite story with a brief account of the Peterloo massacre of 1819 and the Grangemore Rising of 1820, resuming again only with Chartism and the foundation of the Northern Star by Joshua Hobson in Leeds in November 1837. But between those two events, 1820 and 1837, lay another which entered the myth. That was the pilgrimage to York in Easter 1832, led by one of the great iconic figures of the radical West Riding, Richard Ostler, the Factory King. And I think as we think about the pilgrimage to York in Easter 1832, we can hear echoes of that earlier great pilgrimage to York in 1807, when voters had poured out of their West Riding communities in their thousands to register their votes against the slave-owning and master manufacturer supporting Henry Lascelles, and to vote in favour of William Wilberforce, as well as the Whig Lord Milton. Ostler was a Methodist by upbringing, the youngest son of Robert Ostler, who a generation earlier had led the revolt of Leeds Wesleyans into the New Connection, and had subsequently visited Robert Owen's New Lanark as part of a Leeds delegation. Young Ostler was proud to recall being hit by a missile aimed at Wilberforce during the 1807 election campaign. He later rejected both the Methodism of his father and the Whig liberalism of that maker and leader of public opinion in the manufacturing districts of the West Riding, Edward Baines of the Leeds Mercury. But Richard Ostler's passion continued to be stirred by the one radical campaign that was dear to the hearts of Liberals and Wesleyans alike in Yorkshire at this time. That is the campaign against slavery. This campaign, like the one before it against the slave trade, was important, not only as an early recognition of the fundamental rights of a common humanity, but as a model for future radical organisation. That Yorkshire, thanks to Wilberforce, evangelical churchmen, Wesleyans, and other nonconformists, was central to the anti-slavery campaign is important, reminding us of the range and diversity of historical events that fall under the heading of radicalism. But Ostler was infuriated by the complacent concentration of campaigners on black chattel slavery abroad, against which they signed their petitions at chapel on Sundays, while the same people were employing children in conditions akin to slavery in the worsted mills of Bradford. The 10 Hours movement created by Ostler and his supporters was, I suggest, the single most important event in the first half of the 19th century to shape the course of extra-parliamentary radicalism in West Yorkshire for a generation and more. As with the campaign against slavery, eventual success came from the combined efforts of parliamentary campaigners and the struggles of those whose families themselves were oppressed by what they were fighting against. The short time committees of working men provided the organisation and personnel for a host of successor movements by which the working people of West Yorkshire sought to liberate themselves. Among those from Huddersfield who went up the hill to Fixby to make the celebrated compact with Ostler in June 1831 were the leaders of local radicalism for the next 20 years. One, Joshua Hobson, was to become the voice of the West Riding, the name of his strident, unstamped penny weekly, which he edited and published in 1833-4. And though only a periodical, it reads like a prototype for the Chartist Northern Star newspaper, launched by Yorkshire radicals in the autumn of 1837 and published in Leeds by Hobson, who later became its editor. The 10 Hours movement fed imperceptibly into the agitation against the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, as its enormity became appreciated by the West Riding communities when Alfred Power tried to implement the Act locally in 1837. The outcry, demonstrations, and programme of non-implementation marked West Yorkshire out as one of the areas of fiercest resistance to the Bastilles and Guardians imposed by the Act. Now, the details of the next 15 years need not detain us, or we'll be here all day. They are well known. The upsurge in both Chartism and Owenism in West and South Yorkshire have already been noted. the violence in both Sheffield and West Yorkshire in early 1840s, the so-called plug riots of the summer of 1842, retailed by Frank Peel, the notoriety of Bradford's woolcombers rising in violence in the late spring of 1848, the longevity of Chartism in Halifax, where Ernest Jones's personal following remained strong well into the 1850s, and where memories of Chartism persisted many years beyond that. In my own work on secularism in the 1850s and later, I was struck by the persistence of this radicalism in the smaller communities of the textile districts and the focus for continuing activity provided by the larger town centres such as Huddersfield and Halifax. Historians have seen a lull in radicalism between the failure of the mass Chartist movement and the rise of late Victorian socialism, but I think they've missed the point. Is it forgotten how many have met at Blackstone Edge, at Skircote Moor, or at Shipley Glen? It will be so again when we give the call, declared the Yorkshire Tribune, a monthly journal of democracy and secularism in 1855. And give the call they did, and their like afterwards on several occasions for decades well into the 1890s, supporting the agitation for parliamentary reform in the 1860s, the Republican cause in the 1870s, and Charles Bradlaugh's fight for his right to take his parliamentary seat in the 1880s. What's impressive about this radicalism is the strength of community and tradition over many years. As a young man, William Harold Johnson had worked on the Yorkshire Tribune, and in 1888 he recalled the huge black flag of Paddock which had flaunted in many a struggle when Richard Ostler was steward of Fixby Hall. This flag may well have originated with a protest staged after Peterloo in 1819, and continuity was maintained by men like John Spencer of Halifax, an old Chartist, who was secretary of the Halifax Secular Society in 1863, and a devotee of Charles Bradlaugh. And a man in similar vein was John Snowdon, also of Halifax, a Chartist and reformer, a supporter of Charles Bradlaugh, who was elected to the Halifax School Board, but was never eligible to vote for his own MP, for he died in September 1884, just before the longed-for franchise reform was granted. A younger member of the same fraternity was Aurelius Basilio Wakefield, son of an old Chartist, who was sacked from Kitson's in Leeds for labour activism. He organised a mass meeting in support of Bradlaugh on Skircote Moor in 1883, and in support of repeal of the blasphemy laws at Shipley Glen in 1890. He was a trustee of the Brighouse Radical Association, and he received a testimonial from the Brighouse South Ward Liberal Club in 1898 for 20 years of service to reform. By the 1890s, radicalism retained some men within popular liberalism, but it took others over into socialism. In Huddersfield, Owen Bamforth was a keen supporter, as his name suggests, of the cooperative movement, popular education, and a brand of radical liberalism that saw a revival in liberal electoral fortunes in Huddersfield in the Edwardian period. But his father, Watts Bamforth, who was an old Chartist, represented Huddersfield at the founding conference of the ILP in Bradford in 1893, and then became a member of the ILP, along with his younger son, Ramsden, I hasten to add, named after his grandmother, not after the Lord of the Manor. Ramsden Bamforth, who followed the path of ethical socialism into the Unitarian ministry. Yes, radicalism ran in families, but not necessarily in exactly the same channel. Now, it's easy to be attracted by some of the colourful characters who've always divided and led the left in British politics, and I'm going to be tempted to conclude with a few of them. There's no better insight into that little world in West Yorkshire than the pages of the Bradford Truth Seeker, edited by John Grange between 1894 and 1899, and subsequently by John William Gott, whom I've already mentioned. The men who gravitated towards West Yorkshire in the early 1900s, calling their organisation by such names as the British Secular League, Treasurer J.W. Gott, and the Freethought Socialist League, Secretary J.W. Gott, included three individuals who personify the claim of the West Riding to have been home to a remarkable variety of extreme radicalisms. Bradford was at the heart of several radical movements in the 1890s and Edwardian period, and not least the ILP. One of these radicals was J. Greaves Fisher, the bearded Irish tricyclist, founder of a Leeds firm of industrial grease manufacturers, which gave employment, among other things, to Freethought lecturers who couldn't get a job. One of them was Tommy Jackson, later a prominent member of the Communist Party. Another was the future communist Guy Aldred. Fisher's firm still exists as a profit-sharing cooperative called Kingfisher Lubrication. Greaves Fisher was an advocate of reform spelling, so that one can hear his Irish accent in his letters. He was president of the Legitimation League, founded in Leeds in 1893 to agitate for the legitimation of illegitimate children born of free love unions. And he stood as Liberty candidate for East Bradford in 1892 on a platform of voluntary taxation, no compulsory education, liberty for Ireland with no government, the abolition of professional monopolies, and female freedom. Well, you can't get much more radical than that, unless you turn to another of that circle, the man who called himself Malfew Seclu, the man without a soul, the self-styled philosopher of egoism, who described himself as a jocular jawsmith by inclination, an uncommercial traveller by occupation, and a Napoleon of labour by inspiration. I am an iconoclastic, atheistic, anarchistic, hedonistic individualist with a social instinct well developed and with syndicalist solutions for the problem of poverty. And my final character is John William Gott, secretary of the Freethought Socialist League, a Bradford tailor, purveyor of packaged tea, innovative advertiser, employer of commissioned salesmen recruited from among the victimized, ardent socialist, passionate freethinker, publisher extraordinary, and frequent prisoner for the crime of blasphemous libel and for having a sense of humour not shared by the prosecuting authorities. He was the last man to be jailed for the offence of blasphemy in England when he received 9 months hard labour in 1921. So, though the West Riding was far more than home to forms of radicalism, and we must concede it was no more radical than a similar county such as Lancashire, I think we can truly say that the West Yorkshire, the West Riding as a whole, can claim to be regarded throughout the 19th century as one of the major centres of radicalism. And in telling that story, we've come a long way from Luddism to the ILP, from John Baines and the Crispin Inn to Victor Grayson and the Colne Valley. But all this was held within a conscious tradition of dissent in God's, or should it be Gott's, own county. The mythic story is celebrated in popular memory and legend, but it's grounded in real events and in real communities, in a real struggle for independence, self-respect, political rights, and freedom.
Thank you, Professor Royle. Sadly, this pre-recorded event doesn't allow for the usual questions and answers. But if there are questions or comments, please send them to the editors of our newsletter. The address is on the screen as I speak. Both your questions and Professor Royle's answers will be published in a future newsletter. And finally, I would particularly like to thank Professors Royle and Thornton for their tributes to Malcolm Chase. I've spoken to Shirley, Malcolm's widow, and she and their daughter Sarah have asked me to express their appreciation for the lecture's dedication and for our tributes. Thank you all for being with us. Take care, stay well. We hope you can join us in more familiar circumstances very soon.